Welcome back. Today it's part 2 in my series on iconic rock album covers. I decided on 3 covers from the decade of the 70s this time, ones that I'm sure you're all familiar with, but hopefully you will learn something new about that will enhance your appreciation of these great classic rock and roll images. The thing I love most about this cover is the undeniably creepy and unsettling vibe that it gives off. Just imagine taking this record home, putting on your headphones, and dropping the needle onto side 1. You hear the sound of a thunderstorm, a tolling bell, and then a guitar riff that sounds like the gates of hell have opened up as you stare at this image. The cover photo was shot at the Maple Durham Watermill on the River Thames in Oxfordshire, England, by a guy called Keith Macmillan, who also photographed many well-known rock personalities during the course of his career. The model was a woman named Louisa Livingstone, and just to add a little more mystery to the whole thing, apparently her identity was not widely known until around 2020. Here's a photo of that same watermill on a bright sunny day in more modern times. It looks downright charming and idyllic, but back in the early 70s, the area was very decrepit and run down, and as you know, looked spooky as hell. Livingstone recalls having to get up at 4 a.m. for the shoot and remembers that it was unbearably cold and dark. This was certainly exacerbated by the fact that she supposedly wore absolutely nothing underneath the black cloak we see in the picture. Meanwhile, Macmillan recalls that they experimented briefly with some more suggestive poses, but decided against it in the end as he felt that any hint of sexuality would detract from the somber mood, and I think that was a great call. In 1969, Macmillan had been to see an exhibition of Belgian surrealist René Magritte, and it literally changed his life and his art. Now, I would never think of Magritte when looking at this album cover, but it certainly does have a surrealistic feel. To achieve that effect, Macmillan used Kodak infrared film, which produced the pinkish hue that we see. By the way, I also love the greenish tint on the model's skin. I don't know how he achieved that, but that definitely adds to the effect. Macmillan said he also tweaked the chemistry later in the process to darken the image. He chose Livingstone from a host of potential models, partially due to her small stature, which he felt would add grandeur to the scenery around her, and I think that was another great call. I love the way she looks so otherworldly, almost separate from her surroundings, and she always looked to me like she was floating. There's one detail on which Macmillan and Livingstone disagree. Macmillan says that Louisa is actually holding a small black cat that he had brought along as a prop. If so, I can't see it. It looks to me like she's just holding her cloak shut, probably trying to keep out the bitter cold. And Livingstone said she's pretty sure she would have remembered it if she was holding a cat, which seems very likely to me. Whatever the case, if the cat is there, I'm glad that it's not visible, because for me, that would have made the whole thing a lot more cartoonish. The album had a gatefold sleeve, which caused a bit of controversy. It featured an inverted cross with a poem inscribed inside. This poem was written by Roger Brown, who was Macmillan's photographic assistant. The theme of the poem is very much in keeping with the front cover image. I'll just read the last bit. The long black night begins, yet still by the lake a young girl waits. Unseeing, she believes herself unseen. She smiles faintly at the distant tolling bell and the still falling rain. Considering the fact that Who's Next is undoubtedly one of the most loved and iconic rock album covers of all time, you might be surprised to hear Who songwriter and guitarist Pete Townshend's opinion of it. It's another piece of shit. I hate it. It's a horrible thing, just horrible. Of course I don't like it. It's got no artistic consequence whatsoever. No link to the music. It's meaningless. It's four guys stopping in a car and pissing up against a chunk of concrete. All right, tell us how you really feel, Pete. For me, this is an example of a case where I'm glad the artist didn't get his way. I understand what Townsend is saying. I realize this cover has nothing to do with the music inside. But what can you say? It somehow just works. It's a cool image and we all love it. The photo was taken on July 4th, 1971, as the band were driving from Sheffield to Leicester and past the Easington Colliery. What we're looking at here is just a concrete pillar in a slag heap. The story goes that Who bassist John Entwistle and drummer Keith Moon had been discussing Stanley Kubrick's film 2001: A Space Odyssey, which had been released in 1968 and was still a big thing at this time. Somebody came up with the idea of pulling over and trying some photographs with the band reacting to the concrete piling in a similar way to the apes reacting to the monolith in 2001. Several attempts were made, but it quickly became obvious that that concept wasn't really working. At some point, Townsend sauntered over to the concrete piling and peed on it, at which point the photographer, Ethan Russell, decided to go with the flow and came up with the idea of an image in which it appeared that the entire band had just peed on the concrete. Unfortunately, the rest of the band couldn't perform on cue, so the desired effect was achieved by pouring rainwater against the concrete from a film canister. The dramatic clouded sunset sky that we see on the actual cover was added after the fact by the cover's art director, John Kosh, to add an otherworldly effect. And to me, this is everything. Look at the bland, washed-out sky on the aborted 2001 concept. It really falls flat. But the added sky, along with the concrete monolith and the barren, coal-filled landscape, produces a bleak, apocalyptic effect. Several other cover concepts were floated, which, thank God, did not pass muster. These included a picture of the band urinating on a stack of Marshall amps, an image of an overweight nude woman with the band's faces covering her genitalia, I kid you not, and a photo of drummer Keith Moon wearing black lingerie, a brown wig, and holding a whip. This last image was included in a couple of the Who's Next CD reissues, and I'm sorry, but if I had to see it, so do you. Now, if Pete Townsend thinks that the cover we all know and love was lowbrow, amateurish, and had nothing to do with the music, I can't imagine why he would have entertained any of those concepts. That's a real head-scratcher. I've always liked the back cover as well. It's another Ethan Russell photo. A portrait of the band sitting around a table in a cluttered room, taken backstage after a gig in northern England. The photo manages to capture the personalities of the band members. Keith Moon seems to be lashing out at something. Townsend is sort of pulling away. And bass player John Entwistle sitting apart from the rest of the group, staring impassively at the action. Well, if Who's Next was an album cover that bore no relation to the music inside, the same cannot be said of Hotel California. I've always thought this cover was a perfect visual representation of the title track for sure, but really the whole album. The front cover is a shot of the Beverly Hills Hotel taken just before sunset by David Alexander, with design and art direction by none other than John Kosh, who we just discussed in our Who segment. That guy has had an amazingly storied career in album covers going way back to the 1960s. And by the way, I'm not sure if that's the way he pronounces his name. That may be Kosh. Maybe some of you can tell me if you're aware. 3 different hotels were considered for use on the cover, but I think they made a wise choice with this one. It's got a great sort of Southern California mission vibe that goes great with the music. The shot was taken 60 feet above Sunset Boulevard on a cherry picker. When I was a 10-year-old kid listening to this song for the first time, I always envisioned the hotel as being a sort of oasis out in the middle of the desert, as the lyrics imply, on a dark desert highway, cool wind in my hair. Up ahead in the distance, I saw a shimmering light, and the silhouetted palm trees on the cover definitely add to that effect. Due to the unfamiliar vantage point, it took many people a while to figure out that it was the Beverly Hills Hotel they were looking at. At some point, the hotel itself threatened the Eagles with legal action over the cover, although I don't think anything ever really came of that. To round out the front cover, the cool blue neon Hotel California logo was designed by Kosh, who said it was very difficult to bend the neon tubing into the proper shape, so an airbrush was used. In interviews, Kosh has said that Eagles songwriter, vocalist, and drummer Don Henley told him he wanted the hotel portrayed with a slightly sinister edge, and I think this was definitely achieved not only on the front cover, but also on the back cover and gatefold, which portray the same scene at different times. The back cover and gatefold photos were taken in the lobby of the Lido Hotel in Hollywood, which has a slightly seedier look than the Beverly Hills Hotel. The Lido has a really interesting history. It was built in the 1920s as an apartment complex for struggling and sometimes not so struggling actors. People like Carol Burnett lived there at one time or another. The back cover shows the lobby empty, save for a lone janitor in the background sweeping up underneath an arched entryway. And can I just say here how much I love this lobby? It's so 70s. You've got the thick shag carpet, the faux wood paneling, old school vending machine against the wall. I really miss this kind of place. It brings back my childhood. And the whole thing is bathed in a soft, beautiful golden light. Open up the gatefold and we see the same lobby thronged with people, with the band themselves front and center looking cool as hell. Eagles guitarist Don Felder, who was not a primary songwriter in the band, but was one of the primary songwriters of the song Hotel California, says that the people we see were basically friends and members of the Eagles organization, lawyers, PR people, makeup artists, you name it. If you look very carefully, you can just make out a couple of shadowy figures in the background. One is barely visible on the left-hand side, standing in a doorway. The other is up on the balcony. The balcony figure in particular has been the subject of much speculation. Felder says he thinks it's a woman, although he couldn't name who. It doesn't look like a woman to me. And I remember when I was a kid, there was a rumor going around that it was Anton LaVey, the founder of the Church of Satan, although I suspect that's probably one of those rock and roll myths right along there with play a Zeppelin record backwards and it tells you to worship the devil. Whatever the case, I think this is one of the greatest examples of an album cover that perfectly captures the spirit of the music within, which in this case is decadent 1970s LA rock culture. And thus ends another video. Remember, financial contributions are hugely appreciated. Buy me a coffee. PayPal, Venmo, Zelle are all options. Look for the links in the description of the video. As some of you saw, we reached the milestone of 2,000 subscribers the other day. That's cool. I'd love to pick up the pace on that. So hopefully you can all help me. Share the video, do whatever you can to spread the word. Thanks a lot. We'll see you soon.